On an afternoon in October of 1984, the horizon over Dawson County, Nebraska, turned the color of a bruised kidney. High-altitude thunder rolled across the plains, heavy and rhythmic, sounding like the heartbeat of an engine with a thrown rod. Christopher Thomas stood at the edge of 400 acres of ripe winter wheat, watching the stalks sway under the pressure of the approaching front. The air smelled of ozone and dry dust. In 1984, a storm wasn't just weather, it was a financial executioner. Christopher was 24 years old and was currently staring at the reason his family's legacy was about to end. The silver Gleaner K Combine sat in the middle of the field like a metallic mummy. It was a machine built for a simpler age, a galvanized ghost that had seen the Thomas family through 20 harvests, but now it was silent. Surrounding the machine were three men who looked like they belonged in a laboratory rather than a Nebraska wheat field. Douglas Parker, the regional service manager for the local dealership, stood with his arms crossed over a crisp, white button-down shirt that hadn't seen a drop of sweat all day. Beside him were two young engineers, Matthew Martin and Anthony Jackson, who had been flown in from the city to troubleshoot the latest fleet of equipment but had been diverted to this emergency as a favor to the bank. They had been there for 6 hours. They had silver toolboxes that cost more than Christopher's first truck and high-tech electronic testers with liquid crystal displays that flickered in the darkening light. They had replaced the starter. They had replaced the solenoid. They had even swapped out the fuel pump, thinking it was a delivery issue. Yet, the Gleaner remained an immovable object. Douglas Parker wiped a microscopic speck of dust from his forehead and slammed the side panel of the combine shut. The sound echoed across the silent field like a gunshot. He turned to Christopher, his expression a mix of practiced sympathy and corporate finality. "She's dead, Chris," Douglas said, his voice loud enough to carry over the rising wind. "The ignition system is completely non-responsive. Our testers aren't even getting a signal from the primary circuit. The reality is, they don't make these parts anymore. This technology is 20 years obsolete. You're looking at a total system failure." Christopher looked at the 400 acres of wheat. In 1984, interest rates had climbed into the high teens, and for some, the prime rate had hit 21.5%. Export markets had collapsed, and land values were dropping $200 an acre per year. Christopher had signed the bank loans for these seeds with the desperate hope that this harvest would be the one to keep the Farmers Home Administration from sending an acceleration notice to his mailbox. "What are my options, Doug?" Christopher asked, his voice tight. "The only way you're getting this wheat out before the rain hits is with a new machine," Douglas said, gesturing toward the road where a flatbed sat ready with a brand new green and yellow harvester. "I can have you in a new cab by sunset. It's $100,000, financed over 7 years. It's the most advanced tractor money can buy. Otherwise, you stay here and watch this crop rot in the mud. Insurance doesn't cover a machine that won't start." $100,000. In a year when the federal land bank was failing for the first time since the Great Depression, that number felt like a death sentence. Christopher looked at the Gleaner. It had been his father's pride. Now, it was just junkyard scrap, as the men in town called anything that didn't have a computer chip. That's when the sound came. It wasn't the smooth, quiet hum of a modern diesel engine. It was a rhythmic, slow metallic clanking, the heartbeat of an ancient iron beast. A rusty, two-tone Ford F-150 pulled into the field, its suspension groaning as it crested the rise. The truck had seen 100,000 miles of gravel roads and looked like it was held together by baling wire and stubbornness. The truck came to a stop 10 feet from the high-tech service van. The door creaked open, and George Robinson stepped out. George was 73 years old and had farmed the same 400 acres in the county for 50 years. His face was a map of Nebraska weather, weathered, proud, and etched with the lines of a man who had seen every crisis the Midwest could throw at him. He wore worn overalls and mud-caked boots that had never stepped inside a corporate office. He didn't carry a laptop. He didn't have a digital multimeter. He carried a single, grease-stained canvas tool bag and, looped around his thumb, a 6-inch length of bent steel wire. Douglas Parker didn't even look up at first. "Site's closed to visitors, George. Insurance liability. We're in the middle of a high-level diagnostic here." George Robinson didn't stop walking. He moved with the unhurried gait of a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. He walked past the shiny toolboxes and the flickering screens. He stopped in front of the Gleaner K and looked at it the way a doctor studies an X-ray. "Saw you having some trouble from the road," George said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind. "Thought I might be able to help." Douglas Parker finally turned, a mean chuckle building in his throat. It was the laughter of a man who mistook wealth for worth. Help? With what, George? Your Ford. This combine weighs 15 tons. It's a complex electrical failure. My engineers have millions of dollars in equipment, and they can't find a signal. What makes you think you can do what modern science can't? George didn't respond to the laughter. He just looked at the silver machine, then at the black clouds rolling in from the west. Your machines make horsepower, Doug, George said, echoing a lesson learned 70 years ago. But sometimes, a problem doesn't need more power. It needs better thinking. He stepped toward the Gleaner, his boots sinking into the dry Nebraska dirt, and held up the bent piece of steel wire. The engineers exchanged glances and went silent. The showman had run out of show, and the watcher was just getting started. George Robinson walked a slow circle around the Gleaner K, his hand trailing over the galvanized side panels with the familiarity of a father touching a child's shoulder. To the engineers, this was an 18-year-old relic of the late 1960s, a collection of vibrating belts and unshielded pulleys that had no business in a modern 1984 economy. But George didn't see an antique. He saw a machine built during an era when manufacturers expected you to keep a piece of equipment for 30 years, not trade it in every 5 to satisfy a tax depreciation schedule. He remembered when the first silver Gleaners arrived in Dawson County. They were famous for being built for stubborn, designed by men who knew that a breakdown in a Nebraska field was a crisis of survival, not a service ticket. George stopped near the rear drive tire and looked up at the engine deck. "You know, Christopher," George said, his voice barely rising above the whistle of the wind through the wheat, "your daddy bought this machine because it was honest. In 1970, you didn't need a computer to tell you why an engine wouldn't turn. You just needed to listen to the breath of it." Douglas Parker adjusted his tie, his patience thinning like the topsoil on a rocky Iowa bluff. "George, we've done the listening. We've gone through every diagnostic page in the 1984 service manual." He gestured toward the pile of discarded components on the ground. Matthew and Anthony had already spent the Thomas family's remaining credit on a new starter motor, a heavy-duty solenoid, and a high-flow fuel pump. They were following the modern engineering protocol to the letter. When a system fails, you swap out the modules until the circuit completes. It was a strategy built for speed and machine life preservation, but it assumed the machine was willing to cooperate with the schematic. "We've verified the battery voltage at 12.6. We've tested the draw on the new starter. We've even bypassed the primary ignition switch," Matthew added, tapping his digital screen with a frustrated finger. "The logic says this machine should be running, but we aren't getting a single revolution. The internal resistance in the old wiring must be too high. It's a dead end." George didn't look at the screen. He climbed the ladder to the operator's platform, his boots clanking against the steel rungs with a heavy, solid sound. He didn't sit in the seat. He stood over the steering column, looking at the faded labels on the dash. He reached out and touched the ignition bezel, feeling the slight vibration of the machine as the wind buffeted the heavy header. "That's your first mistake, Douglas," George said, looking down at the service manager. "You're looking at numbers on a screen and thinking they tell you the whole story. You've spent 6 hours measuring voltage, but you haven't spent 1 minute measuring the soul of the machine." George tapped his chest. "When you only look at the data, you forget that machinery has its own breath and heartbeat. A combine that's worked 4,000 hours in Nebraska dust develops its own way of talking to you. If you don't know how to listen to the whispers of time, you'll never understand why it decided to go silent today." The engineers looked at George with the mixture of confusion and contempt that a city man has for a museum piece farmer. To them, the combine was a failed circuit. To George, it was a puzzle that had been sitting in the sun for 14 years, waiting for the right hand to find the first piece. The first drop of rain hit the galvanized tin roof of the workshop with a sound like a small caliber bullet. Christopher Thomas flinched, the sound echoing in the hollow of his chest. He looked out at the horizon. The clouds were no longer purple but a deep, suffocating black, the kind of sky that meant business in 1984. He thought about the $380,000 he owed the bank, a figure that felt heavier than the 60-ton excavator Frank Donnelly had once watched sink into a swamp. He thought about his land, where land values had dropped 63% in just 5 years. If that wheat stayed in the field tonight, it wouldn't be a crop, it would be a monument to his failure. Douglas Parker watched George Robinson reach into his grease-stained tool bag and pull out that 6-inch length of bent steel wire. He let out a sharp, mocking bark of laughter that bounced off the silver sides of the Gleaner. "What's the plan, Grandpa?" Douglas asked, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt a man with a gold watch has for a man with a soil probe. You going to pick the lock on the ignition, or maybe you're going to use that to conduct some lightning into the battery? This isn't 1912, George. You can't fix an electronic failure with a coat hanger. The two young engineers, Matthew and Anthony, didn't bother to hide their smirks. They stood behind their $3,200 digital diagnostic station, a machine that supposedly had more smarts than 50 years of farming. They looked at George's worn overalls and mud-caked boots and saw a museum piece that didn't know it was obsolete. George didn't look up. He was on his knees now in the dirt, his ear pressed against the side of the Gleaner's transmission housing. He wasn't looking at the machine. He was listening to it. "You see, Douglas," George said, his voice flat and steady as a Nebraska highway, "the problem with you and your boys is that you're parts changers. You're not problem solvers. You've been trained to replace the symptom, but you've never been taught to find the disease." "Parts changers?" Douglas repeated, his face turning a shade of red that rivaled the faded paint on a 1961 Farmall 560. "We've replaced $500 worth of components on this machine today. We've followed the technical manual to the letter. We're using the most advanced equipment money can buy." "That's exactly the problem," George said, standing up slowly, his 71-year-old bones taking their time. "When your screen tells you a circuit is open, you replace the whole circuit. You throw $300 of Christopher's money at a new solenoid because the book says that's the next step. You don't ask why the signal is failing. You just assume the machine is too old to understand the instruction. You're trying to open a locked door by pushing harder. While I'm looking at the hinges," George walked toward the electrical panel tucked into a narrow recess behind the driver's seat. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he reached down and scraped a handful of dried mud from the bottom of the cab frame. He rubbed it between his fingers, smelling it. "Let me tell you about Nebraska clay, because you need to understand the earth before you can understand why this machine stopped. This ground is heavy with limestone and clay. It holds moisture like a sponge, and in a season like this, that moisture carries a charge." He pointed at a tiny, almost invisible streak of orange oxidation near the base of the panel. "You've been trying to start this machine for 6 hours. You've put 148 bushels of stress on these batteries. But did any of you notice the way the cabin vibrates when the solenoid clicks? It's not a full engagement. It's a stutter. Your digital testers are looking for a yes or a no, but this machine is giving you a maybe." Christopher stepped forward, his hands deep in the pockets of a Carhartt jacket he had worn for 9 years. "George, I've got 40 men's worth of debt on this harvest. The bank is sitting in Waterloo with their checkbooks and their smiles, just waiting for me to miss a beat. If I don't get this wheat in by tomorrow, I'm in breach of contract with my own life. I don't have 6 months for a chemical solution or a new part to be shipped from Missouri." George looked at the young man and saw the same look Dale Presler had when he realized his 78-foot mark was 9 feet short of what an 18-year-old tractor could do. He saw the desperation of a man who had mistaken wealth for worth and was now paying the price. "Patience is more powerful than strength, Christopher," George said, his voice a calm anchor in the rising storm. "Some problems don't need more power, they need better thinking." George began to probe with the wire, sliding it into a narrow gap in the electrical panel with the precision of a man who had spent 14 years talking to his equipment more than he talked to people. He wasn't looking for a broken wire. He was looking for an application of physics that the engineers with their degrees had ignored. He knew that modern machines were built for speed, but his heart knew that this Gleaner was built for stubborn. He wasn't just checking a circuit, he was dismantling 30 years of arrogance piece by piece. The rain began to fall in earnest now, drumming against the metal, but George didn't move. He kept his hand steady, feeling for the one tiny detail that the million-dollar sensors had missed because it was buried beneath a layer of insulating paint. George Robinson did not rush. He spent the next 20 minutes in a state of absolute stillness, his hand buried deep within the silver guts of the Gleaner K. The rain was no longer a threat. It was a physical weight, drumming against the galvanized panels with a rhythmic intensity that sounded like 1,000 tiny hammers. The two engineers, Matthew and Anthony, huddled under the awning of their high-tech service van, their faces illuminated by the pale blue glow of their digital screens. They were watching the data, waiting for the museum piece to fail, so they could get back to the business of selling Christopher Thomas a debt he couldn't afford. "George, we've been through the schematics," Douglas Parker called out, his voice competing with the thunder. Every electrical path in that machine was mapped by a 1973 mainframe. If there was a contact issue, our testers would have picked up the resistance change. "You're chasing ghosts in a galvanized box." George didn't look up. He was feeling for a specific junction near the neutral safety switch, a component tucked behind the main gearbox, where the factory technicians usually wouldn't look during a standard field service. "That's your second mistake, Douglas," George said. "You're following a standard schematic, but a schematic is just a map of how the machine was supposed to be built. It doesn't tell you how it was built on a Tuesday morning in 1970. George pulled his hand back, his fingers coated in a mixture of black grease and fine Nebraska dust. He looked at Christopher. "Let me tell you about Service Bulletin FS70-14, because that's the piece of history your engineers didn't find in their computers." The engineers stopped scrolling. Douglas Parker's brow furrowed. "FS70? That's an internal archive. That bulletin was deprecated 10 years ago. It was deprecated because they fixed the problem in the 71 models," George said, his voice as steady as the drawbar on a 1930 crawler. "But this machine was built in the summer of 1970. There was a minor design flaw in the neutral safety switch. The company realized that during high vibration harvests, the contact point would oxidize. They sent out a quiet fix, a copper bypass, but most dealers never bothered to install it unless the machine wouldn't start. They thought a layer of insulating paint would be enough to protect the junction." George held up the 6-inch length of bent steel wire. "Your electronic meters didn't find it because they were looking for a broken wire. But the wire isn't broken. It's insulated. That paint you think is protecting the circuit is actually acting like a wall. Your testers are seeing good voltage because they're hitting the paint, not the copper. You're measuring the skin of the machine, but you haven't reached the bone." George reached through a narrow gap in the gearbox housing, a space so tight that Douglas's high-tech diagnostic probes couldn't reach it. He felt for the oxidized junction, the place where the insulating paint had bled over the contact point 14 years ago. Using the bent wire, he applied a slow, steady pressure. He wasn't trying to force it. He was using leverage to bypass the blockage. "Patience is more powerful than strength, son," George whispered. "More to the machine than to the men watching." He felt the wire click into place, piercing the layer of paint and making contact with the raw copper beneath. It was a mechanical advantage multiplied by 40 years of experience. "Now, Christopher," George shouted over the roar of the rain, "climb up there. Don't look at the gauges. Don't wait for the light. Just turn the key and give her everything she's got." Christopher Thomas didn't hesitate. He scrambled up the ladder, his boots slipping on the wet steel. He dropped into the seat, gripped the key, and turned it. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, the Gleaner K shuddered. The massive belts began to move. The engine groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed too big for the machine's frame. Suddenly, with a sound like thunder underground, the diesel engine roared to life. A thick plume of black smoke erupted from the exhaust stack, a dark declaration of resurrection that cut through the gray rain. The entire workshop floor and the earth beneath it began to vibrate with a raw, consistent power that modern, computer-limited engines were designed to suppress. It wasn't the polite hum of a $100,000 harvester. It was the stubborn torque of a machine that didn't know how to quit. The silver machine was breathing again. The lights on the dash flickered to life, glowing with a warm amber light that had been silent for 6 hours. Christopher sat in the cab, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, as the vibration of the engine traveled through his boots and into his bones. Douglas Parker stood frozen in the rain, his white shirt now transparent and plastered to his skin. He looked at his $5,000 diagnostic station, which was still reporting a system failure, and then, at the roaring Gleaner K, his engineers, Matthew and Anthony, were already coiling their cables, their faces stripped of their earlier arrogance. George Robinson stepped back from the machine, wiping his grease-stained hands on a rag. He didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at the silver combine and nodded once, a gesture of respect between two veterans who had survived another day in the Nebraska clay. "She's got a lot of pull left in her, Christopher," George said, his voice barely audible over the engine's roar. "You just had to remind her why she was built." Douglas Parker stood in the swirling Nebraska rain, his designer shirt clinging to his chest like a wet shroud. His face had gone pale, and for the first time in his 20-year career, his hands were shaking. He looked at his $3,200 diagnostic station, which was still displaying a blue-lit map of a dead system, and then he looked at the Gleaner K. The silver combine wasn't just running, it was roaring with a deep, rhythmic chuffing that made the very earth beneath his polished boots tremble. Matthew and Anthony, the young engineers, began coiling their cables in a silence that was heavier than the black clouds above. They didn't look at Douglas. And they certainly didn't look at George Robinson. They had been trained to believe that if a computer couldn't see a problem, the problem didn't exist. Now, they were watching a 64-year-old man and a 6-inch piece of wire do what their $1 million of modern technology could not. Douglas Parker finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and cracked compared to the engine's roar. "How?" he asked, stepping toward George. "How did that wire find a signal that my high-frequency testers couldn't even detect?" George Robinson didn't turn around immediately. He was watching Christopher Thomas engage the header, the massive silver blades beginning to spin with a mechanical hunger. "Your testers were looking for electricity, Douglas," George said, his voice flat and steady. "But this machine wasn't missing electricity. It was missing a connection to its own history. You were fighting the whole circuit at once, trying to open a locked door by pushing harder. I just worked the hinges. I took the resistance apart piece by piece until the signal didn't have any choice but to go through." Douglas reached into his jacket, his movement slow and mechanical, and pulled out a leather checkbook. "What do I owe you, George?" he asked. "Name your price. I've spent 6 hours and $1,500 of company credit, failing to do what you just did in 20 minutes. George stopped wiping his hands and looked at the service manager for a long moment. Neither man spoke as the rain hammered the tin roof of the workshop. "You don't owe me a dime, Douglas," George said finally. "I didn't do this for you. I did it because this machine was built for stubborn, and it was annoying me to see it acting like it was smarter than the man who bought it." He paused, looking at Christopher Thomas, who was now pulling the Gleaner K out of the shop and toward the 400 acres of wheat. "But if you want to pay someone, write a check to the local Mechanical Historical Society. Tell them it's for the labor of knowing where to put the wire. Put $20 on the line for the steel, and whatever your pride can afford for the lesson." Douglas Parker hesitated, then wrote a check for $10,000. He handed it to George with a nod that wasn't an apology, but a surrender. "I learned something today, George," Douglas said quietly. "I learned that expensive doesn't mean better, and new doesn't mean smarter." George Robinson didn't respond. He watched the Gleaner K roll out into the field, its silver skin shimmering under the lightning strikes. As the first heavy sheets of rain began to turn the Nebraska soil into a thick black muck, the combine's header dropped. It began to move through the wheat at a stately 5 miles per hour, trailing a cloud of dust and chaff that the wind instantly whipped away. Let me tell you about the harvest that followed, because the story doesn't end when the engine starts. Christopher Thomas worked through the night, the Gleaner K's headlights cutting through the darkness like 2 amber eyes, while his neighbors were huddled in their homes, listening to the news of a 21.5% prime rate and watching their dreams wash away in the mud. Christopher was gathering his legacy. He harvested 400 acres of wheat in 18 hours of continuous work. The grain was dry, the yield was respectable, and every bushel was a strike against the bank that had been waiting for him to fail. Christopher didn't buy the $100,000 harvest that Douglas Parker had offered. He kept the Gleaner K for another 16 years. He learned to rebuild the engine himself, using the books George Robinson had given him and the tools his father had left behind. He never borrowed another dime from the bank. When the farm crisis of the 1980s claimed 300,000 American farms, Christopher Thomas's land stayed in his name because he had learned that the ground was never the problem, the debt was. Let me tell you about George Robinson, because he lived another 12 years and never once changed his boots. He became something of a local legend in Dawson County. People would drive out to his farm just to see his workshop, to hear the story of the 6-inch wire, and to understand how an old man and simple physics had beaten $1 million of modern technology. George always told the story the same way, ending it with the same lesson. "My father used to say that people get confused about what makes machines powerful," George would say, patting the faded hood of his own tractor. "They think it's about horsepower, about size, or about how much force you can generate. But that's not what power is. Power is about applying force effectively. A lever is more powerful than a hammer, and patience is more powerful than strength." George Robinson died in 1996 at the age of 85. His funeral was the biggest the county had seen in decades, and in the procession behind the hearse, Christopher Thomas drove the silver Gleaner K, its galvanized panels polished until they shone like new money. The modern world teaches us how to replace what is broken, but the past teaches us how to understand things to their very core. Every year in October, when the thunder rolls across the Nebraska horizon and the clouds turn the color of engine oil, people in Dawson County remember the old man and the wire. They remember that some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. Somewhere in a barn in central Nebraska, that Gleaner K is still sitting under a canvas tarp, waiting for the next storm, the next problem, and the next person who thinks technology can solve everything. Its engine can still roar, its gears can still turn, and its silver skin still carries the secret of a $20 fix for a $100,000 problem. Because when the showman runs out of show and the hydraulics give up the ghost, the old ways will still be there, ready to pull out what the new ways can't.